Hi everyone, let's talk about plywood today and why I think and why I'm sure it's a scam. So in general, I'm a person who's very sensitive when it comes to talking about plywood. It's a very delicate topic for me, simply because there is a huge discrepancy between my expectations and reality. And it's all because of my background. I started making campervan conversions in Poland some probably 15, 20 years ago. And basically, I took a lot of things for granted. I expected that plywood is equal everywhere, and I was met with my huge disappointment. Simply because in Poland or in Europe in general, we have a multitude of types of plywood. Each plywood sheet comes in probably 10, 12, sometimes more thicknesses. So you can choose whether you want 2 millimeter thick plywood, maybe 4, maybe 4.5, 5, 6, 10, 12, etc., etc. So you have a huge range of thicknesses, and out of each type of plywood, we have plywood with made out of birch, we have plywood made out of pine, with some oak veneers, everything actually. And for me this was normal. So when I decided that I'm going to chase slightly better weather and I moved to California, I expected even a bigger market. But it's not true. When I entered Home Depot, when I entered Lowe's, I just started crying. Yeah, it was a bad experience. It was a shock for me. I've never seen so many low-grade types of plywood with holes, with uneven surface, all twisted, warped, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, and so I started looking for plywood elsewhere. I found some dedicated suppliers, and unfortunately it was the same. Whenever I found some quality plywood, it was only available as quarter-inch plywood, half-inch plywood, three-quarter-inch plywood. So basically 3 thicknesses, sometimes 4, 3/8, coming in somewhere in between. And nothing else actually. There were also like only a few types I could choose from, and basically most of them were lower quality. So I was highly disappointed, and I am still. I'm trying to find some alternatives, and I'm really full of envy when I look at my friends from Europe who can choose whatever they want. And even there is plywood which is imported from Central America, which is available all around the globe, in Europe, for example, but it's not available nearby. And by nearby, I mean, for example, the west coast of the United States. So this is really weird for me, but there is something going on with plywood, and that's what I'm sure of. Okay, so let's start with the basics. How do we recognize good plywood from bad plywood? Let me grab a piece here. For example, we have plywood here. Okay, so I know that first of all we look at the faces and we see if what we see is what we like. But the most important thing is looking at the edges of plywood, because as the name implies, plywood should have a lot of layers. Yeah, should have a lot of plies. Unfortunately, in the case of the United States, you mostly find plywood with 3, 4, or 5 layers, which is a disaster. Let me show you what it looks like over here. Okay, so for example, here we have some sort of like, this is still like better quality than what you can find in big box stores. So it's slightly better, but you can see what I can see. Yeah, you see some voids. The layers are thick instead of being thin. The layers are spongy. This is basically there's like a piece missing here. from the factory. So this is what we should avoid, and this is what we should look for when we want to buy some quality plywood. So basically this is 18 millimeter plywood, and you can see how many layers we have here. Plenty of layers, while here, well, okay, not so much. So if you can, try to avoid this and try to get something like this. And why is it so? First of all, when you have multiple layers, the plywood is more stable. It will not warp easily, it will not deform. Very often it will not swell in case of increased humidity. So in general it's a better material, simply because it contains more glue in between the layers, and this is like a composite, yeah? So the balance between material A, which is the wood, and material B, which is the glue, which bonds everything together, is more or less the proper one. If you have too much wood, if you have not enough layers, then the quality of the plywood is much worse. It doesn't cut equally well, so try to avoid it, but I understand if you live where I live, it's not going to be easy. The second thing you should try to look for is faces which look more or less decent. So you should try to avoid any eggs, any balls on the surfaces. Let me just try to find an example for you. Okay, I'm back. So in general, the idea of the manufacturers is that if the top layers, the top veneers have some flaws, in order not to throw away the entire sheet of plywood, but sort of try to sell it, they fill in the gaps with some, I don't know if it's visible here, with some eggs, some materials here. And in theory, the idea is that this is not visible. It's not as much visible, yeah? But in practice, you can see it almost from every angle. There is no way you're going to hide it, yeah? No matter how you look at it, you can always see that this is like an insert which should not be here. Many types of plywood have only inserts, those eggs on one side, while the other side is completely okay. So probably I would buy this type of plywood because you will be able to determine which side it will be visible, which will be invisible on the inside. But in general, there are also many situations where you buy a sheet and it's ugly on both sides. And the problem is that if you want to put a clear coat on that piece of plywood, it's going to look terrible. Even if you try to paint it, you will probably need to paint multiple layers to try to hide the difference in texture this insert creates. So in general, try to avoid those inserts because sooner or later you're gonna have problems. And now the biggest problem. Most of plywood sold in the United States, maybe 80%, maybe 90%, has fake top layers. That's how I call it. Let me show you what I mean. So yeah, let's return to this type of plywood we have here. Looks nice, and of course when you join two pieces together, when you're making a cabinet, you always want to sand this layer so that it's smooth, and make sure that it looks nice. But when you try to cut this piece of plywood on your table saw, it suddenly starts to splint like this. And the reason why is because you have those ugly, terrible, thick layers, and normally you think that this is layer number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, but you need to notice that there is like a paper thin top layer on top of the last veneer. So you have like I call it fake layers. So you have one here and you have one here. And the problem is that they are so thin that whenever you try to sand it down to make the area smooth, you usually sand through this layer, and underneath you find some sort of like ugly grayed wood. And another problem is that those layers, they hardly stick to the base plywood layers. So normally you can just grab it with your finger and just get rid of it. This is a huge problem because whenever you're cutting your plywood pieces, you end up with edges that look like this. Oh, maybe let's go somewhere else. I will show you a better example. Okay, I bought a sheet of plywood and it got delivered a few days ago. I use it for structural things, so it doesn't really matter for me, but this is what you will be dealing with most often. Fake layer which is hiding some ugly yellowish type of plywood. Oh, look at this. Look at this thing. Oh, we've made it quite far, you see? And this is less than a sheet of paper. You can see light coming through it. So just be careful if you want to sand something, just be careful if you want to sand your plywood, you need to make sure you don't buy this type of crappy, shitty plywood. I'm not afraid to say it out loud. It's a scam. Another big problem is the so-called pre-finished plywood, which means that it's already shiny and nice, and well, it's pre-finished, yeah. So both sides are already coated with some sort of paint, some sort of transparent lacquer. But the problem is that this surface is very delicate. It doesn't come even close to regular floor finish. You can just basically scratch it with anything. And the problem with this type of plywood is strictly your manufacturing workflow. It means that from the moment you buy this sheet or a few sheets of pre-finished plywood to the moment you finish your cabinets, they are all going to be really, really scratched. So you end up with a finish which is basically useless. You pay more for the pre-finished plywood. It's not so easy to sand it down because very often, as we know, it's also going to have this fake layer on top. So you can do whatever you want, but I always avoid pre-finished plywood because I cannot do anything with it. By the time I finish my cabinet, it's going to be scratched somewhere. So it really doesn't make any sense. The painting should be the last thing you do. So first you make the cabinet, then you paint it, not the other way around. And the last thing I would like to discuss is the weight of plywood. In the case of cabinets made for a regular kitchen, it really doesn't matter because they will stay in one place for the next 10 or 5 or 15 or 40 years. But in the case of a moving vehicle, you need to watch your weight. So making everything out of Baltic birch is probably not the best idea because you're going to be paying more in brake pads. You're going to have slightly worse handling and safety. You're going to pay more in gas and all that kind of stuff. So it probably doesn't make too much of a difference, but it's always better to keep the weight as low as possible. In Europe, we have problems because we have the limits set quite low, and there are police officers trying to catch camper vans, and they put them on scales to see if the weight is within limits. This is not the case in the United States, so you could make your cabinets out of concrete, but it's really not a good idea. So try to watch the weight, and my suggestions are that you should look for Luan plywood, which is a little bit spongy but lightweight. I don't think you will find Seba plywood, which is popular in Europe but unavailable in the United States for unknown reasons. Another type would be maybe poplar, but I don't know if it's going to be cheap enough and available everywhere. And there, at least here in my area, there is a type of plywood which they call just Chinese birch. I don't know what it means. It doesn't tell me anything. It's just the way they call it at my distributors, Chinese birch. And it's more or less okay. It doesn't have enough layers, but for the structural pieces of your cabinets, it's good enough, cheap enough, and good enough. The faces, the doors of the cabinets, I usually use Baltic birch because of the higher quality. But please don't forget that weight is very important. Oh, and one more thing. There's also a type of plywood, I don't know if I should call it plywood, which is called lumber core. And this is it. It looks like normal plywood, but it's made out of strips of wood, which are sandwiched in between two veneers. Let me show you what it looks like. Okay, I don't know if I'm going to fit this piece here, but okay, it fits. So you have the top veneer, you have the bottom veneer, and you have the planks, the strips of solid wood in between. There are some voids, of course, but it's structural, so it doesn't matter that much. This is what it looks like, and it's usually cheaper than plywood, but for the back or the sides of your cabinets, it's absolutely good enough. Yeah, so as you could see, it's really nice. It has some voids. They should be covered with some sort of edge banding if possible. And I wouldn't use it for horizontal surfaces like bed platforms, because this will not withstand the weight. But if you have vertical surfaces like the sides of your cabinets, it's absolutely good enough, or absolutely ideal, maybe even, to use it, because it's cheaper than plywood. It doesn't need to be as strong as plywood, because it's going to be like only a piece of a cabinet. So this is called lumber core, at least in the United States, at least in my area. Elsewhere, officially, it's also called block wood plywood. But probably lumber core is also going to be a name people are familiar with. All right, so why do I think that plywood is a scam in the United States? Well, it's very simple. Distributors are very happy that people don't know. People don't know anything more than they can see. So when a typical citizen goes to Home Depot, he or she looks at this crap and he or she thinks, oh, it's plywood. Well, it's not. If somebody has a different background, if somebody has a different reference point, then it's a disaster. And all the manufacturers are taking advantage of this, and they just don't want to import, they don't want to produce higher quality plywood, simply because people don't know plywood can be better. And that's a huge problem, at least for me. And I'm really hoping this is going to change somehow in the future, but I don't see any light at the end of the tunnel yet, because everywhere I go, plywood is the same, unfortunately. Okay, and finally, let's talk about Baltic birch. Let's talk about the magic of Baltic birch. What makes it so strong, what makes it such a good material, is the manufacturing process. So multiple layers, very well compressed, no voids, no foreign objects inside, which is very often the case. If there's something that enters in between the layers, it's removed instead of being just pressed together. Maybe I'm going to, maybe I will be able to find an example for you. Okay, here we have one, for example. Yeah, this is not Baltic birch, this is something called Tiger Ply, which is also a product I like. But for example, if you want to expose the sides, if you want to make a door out of it and not put any edge banding, but you like those lines, I really like those lines as well. I like plywood in general. You end up with something like this. Oh, something didn't work, let's press it together. Oh, it didn't work here either, let's press it together too. And maybe on the other side we're gonna find some some voids, something strange happening here, and on the other side also something's wrong with the plywood. So as you can see, the faces are really nice, but sometimes the sides, the edges are kind of ugly. Almost all the plywood sold in the United States doesn't come from the United States. It's imported from all over the world, and unfortunately only the lowest grades. So in terms of nature, in the US there is enough nature to give us the capabilities to produce really good plywood, but simply the manufacturers are greedy / lazy, and they just don't want to do it. So we need to deal with the materials we have, unfortunately. But as I said, I really hope that maybe someday in the future things will change for the better. Thank you very much for staying with me till the end. I really hope you enjoyed this video and you learned something. Please subscribe and see you next time. Bye bye.